This episode is sponsored by Archaeologist Tours. Want to dig deeper into Mexico's indigenous past and present? Allow Archaeologist Tours to customize your Yucatan adventure. Archaeologist works hand in hand with local indigenous guides to provide a tour that is entertaining, educational, and beneficial to the local community. For an adventure like no other, check out archaeogato.com. That's ARKEOGATO.com. Or just follow the link in the show notes. Now, on with the show. This episode is sponsored by Archaeologist Tours. Want to dig deeper into Mexico's indigenous past and present? Allow Archaeologist Tours to customize your Yucatan adventure. Archaeologist works hand in hand with local indigenous guides to provide a tour that is entertaining, educational, and beneficial to the local community. For an adventure like no other, check out archaeogato.com. That's ARKEOGATO.com. Or just follow the link in the show notes. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and why that's so, and why that's so. And why
Greetings,
that's so.
dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Atlantis. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa.
And Ruben Ariano Tlacateca.
So what's going on, man?
Not much.
How you been?
Been pretty good. Can't complain.
Nice. School's going well. All the little students are eagerly soaking up the knowledge that
they're
you're kicking.
soaking it up. Yeah. Eager beavers.
So I went to the SAAs recently. That was pretty awesome. Met a lot of cool people.
Yeah.
And for those that don't know, the SAAs is the Society of American Archaeology. We had our national conference in Portland, Oregon, and I'd never been to the Pacific Northwest, so that was really cool. Michelle was able to come out with me, so we rented a car, went to the coast. It was a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah, I've never been up to the Pacific Northwest either.
I highly recommend it. I really liked it. I like that kind of weather, like it really green and lush, but it was always kind of overcast and intermittent rain, and I don't know, man. I really enjoyed myself.
Cool.
It spoke to my nature. But a really cool thing that happened there was I saw David Stewart, Dr. David Stewart.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Like walking off in the distance, and I'm like, oh shit, I want to introduce myself to him and take a picture with him, right? This guy's like, it's a pretty big deal. And so I walk up, and he's got his back turned to me, and I say, Dr. Stewart. And he turns around and he smiles and he goes, oh, hey, Kurly, how are you? And he reached his hand out, shook his hand, and we spoke for a little bit. And he's like, you know what? Because I said, well, I'm a fan of your work. And he said, well, I'm a fan of your work. I listen to the podcast, and
nice. Shout
I
out.
use your Nahuatl videos in my class to help with pronunciation. So
had you met him before?
No, never. Like, we've texted or Twittered.
Yeah. So he recognized you from social media.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then he uses the videos, so he knew what I look like.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But shout out to David Stewart.
Absolutely.
For listening. And he wants to come on the show. So,
well, we have to have him on the show then.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that we've said it out loud, we better make it happen.
Make it happen. Yeah, I don't have anything new to report as far as my ons and goings. Just hanging in there, just doing my stuff. I do want to make a shout out to the Mexican American Museum of Texas, which is a newly created nonprofit that I am a founding member of. We founded it last summer, and we had our very first exhibit in December. It was called the Tamalada exhibit, where we showcased the various regions of Texas. There's 7 official regions, and so we solicited essays and pictures from families from the 7 regions, and that was our first exhibit at City Hall, Dallas downtown. And that was very, well received, and so now we are on our second exhibit called Tejanas at the Alamo, Conduits of Remembrance, and that's an exhibit that is currently being shown at the Hall of State at the State Fair of Texas. So if any of you are interested, it's running through May the 8th. And it's basically, bringing attention to and highlighting the women who were present during the siege of the Alamo, during the battle between Santa Anna and the Mexican forces and the Texian troops that were being headed by David Crockett and James Bowie and
Houston,
that,
right?
Yeah, that history there. And so this exhibit is showcasing the descendants, and we have essays printed out of the descendants of these women who were there, who were one of the few survivors of that battle. And they're very proud of that tradition, that history. And we solicited essays from them, and some of them actually came to speak during the reception. And so it was very nice, also very well received. And we don't have an actual brick and mortar place yet, but we are, doing whatever it takes, talking to the appropriate people and going through the right channels to try to get eventually a place of our own, because right now we're just basically exhibiting wherever we can find space.
Yeah.
And so just wanted
that sounds like a dope ass event, man.
Yeah. So if you're in town or you're going to be in Dallas between whenever you're listening to this in 2023 through the month of May 8th of May, you're welcome to. It's free and open to the public Monday through Friday, and I believe they're also open on Saturday, and it closes depending on the day that you go. It's either 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock, but it's there for you. It's for the community. Come check it out. I did the introductory essay to it. I did a little history, and I put it into context, and so if you do go out there, just don't hesitate to reach out and let me know what you thought of the exhibit. And we have another one that we're planning for late summer of 2023. I'll make an announcement once it's official.
Awesome. That sounds great, man.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So today we're going to be talking about the horse. Of course.
El cuaco.
Every once in a while, I see a story posted on social media claiming that horses never went extinct in the Americas and that indigenous people had the horse long before the arrival of Europeans. And if you've spent any time on indigenous social media, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Supporters of this claim seek to dispel what they view as a Eurocentric myth, a myth that, in their eyes, buries the true history of the horse in the Americas by discounting indigenous oral traditions and ignoring archaeological evidence that would reshape our understanding of history. But do these claims stand up to scrutiny? Did the horse really go extinct in the Americas? And what does all of this have to do with a certain religious zealot from the 1800s? Well, dear listeners, hold on tight, because it's going to be a bumpy ride as we explore
Indigenous people of the Americas and the horse.
So let's start by giving a brief overview of what is currently known about the evolution of the horse. Listeners should know that for this episode, I drew from multiple books, articles, oral traditions, as well as episode number 786 of the Skeptoid podcast, which deals with the same topic. Links to the sources will be included in the show notes.
Skeptoid!
Shout out. So, over a span of 50 million years, the horse, a mammal belonging to the Equidae family, underwent a remarkable evolutionary journey that transformed the Eohippus, a small forest-dwelling creature the size of a dog, into the majestic modern horse. Among all animals, paleozoologists have been able to reconstruct the evolutionary lineage of the horse with the highest level of precision. Most of this evolutionary process occurred in North America, where horses originated but eventually went extinct about 11 to 13,000 years ago during the end of the Pleistocene. In fact, this era saw the extinction of some 32 genera of megafauna in the Americas. This included horses, camels, cave bears, the giant sloth, mammoth, giant beaver, and saber-toothed cats, just to name a few.
Man, that's a lot.
That is a lot of the Pleistocene extinction, or the Pleistocene megafauna extinction. It's a really cool name too. The current prevailing evidence helps explain how horses evolved in the Americas and crossed back and forth across Beringia throughout their evolutionary history. The horses that remained in the Americas went through multiple extinctions, but the population was continuously renewed as horses crossed back and forth in the age prior to their disappearance. However, by the time the last extinction occurred, the Beringian land bridge no longer existed. This meant that repopulation was no longer a possibility, and the horse, along with the other megafauna that we previously mentioned, went extinct in the Americas for the last time.
Mega funny.
Mega funny. So basically, the horses were crossing back and forth across Beringia. Beringia went away. Horses in the Americas went extinct, and the fresh supply of horses that was coming back across Beringia was blocked off because Beringia was gone. It wasn't until the arrival of Christopher Columbus that horses returned to the Americas. These horses were of Iberian origin and were first brought to Hispaniola and later introduced to Panama, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Argentina, and later to Florida in 1538. The first horses to set foot on the mainland were those brought by Hernan Cortés. Subsequent explorers like Coronado and De Soto brought even more horses, which were either sourced from Spain or breeding locations established in the Caribbean. Over time, as Spanish missions were constructed on the mainland, horses were often lost or stolen and eventually proliferated into large herds of feral horses, whom the Spaniards called Mesteños, or Mustangs. Despite Spanish efforts to keep the horse out of indigenous hands, native people saw the value of the horse and acquired them through various means. The largest transfer of horses to indigenous people occurred after the 1680 Pueblo Revolt in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This indigenous uprising resulted in the expulsion of Spanish forces, including their Mesoamerican auxiliaries, from New Mexico, and the release of approximately 1,500 Spanish horses. These horses were traded with other indigenous groups and quickly spread across North America.
Goodbye, horses.
Oh no, sir. I must say you're wrong. Therein lies the conundrum. While there is no material evidence of horses in the Americas between their last extinction, almost 11,000 years ago, to the arrival of Europeans on the American mainland, roughly 500 years ago, there are groups who claim that the horse never went extinct in the Americas. By extension, proponents of this claim also advance the notion that indigenous people have a long, unbroken historical relationship with the horse, which predates Spanish arrival. Unfortunately, the evidence presented, and you'll notice in the script that I put little quotation marks.
Yeah, the scare
evidence.
quotes for evidence.
The evidence presented relies almost entirely on deliberate misrepresentations of actual studies. These dubious sources are then baked with the work of known pseudo-scholars and Mormon propagandists, and what emerges is a veritable stew of fiction, fantasy, and wishful thinking. Unfortunately for them, these half-baked claims are without merit and fall flat upon scrutiny. The following are the three main camps which advocate the never extinct American horse hypothesis.
Number 1. Individuals from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, who notoriously promote pseudo-history in an effort to present the Book of Mormon as a factually based historical document rather than simply as a religious text, which is what it is, really, if you think about it. Number 2. Conservationists who are working to get wild horses granted the status of a threatened or endangered species. Number 3. Indigenous groups who see their relationship with horses as deeply interconnected and spanning millennia since time immemorial.
So the first group, the Mormons, promote the idea that horses never went extinct in the Americas because this would support claims made in the Book of Mormon. You see, the Book of Mormon was written by an individual who didn't know that there were no horses in the Americas during the time period that the Book of Mormon is set in. To make the book historically accurate, an alternative and counterfactual history needs to be created by the modern Mormon Church, because the Book of Mormon mentions horses multiple times, stating that they were known and used by the Jaredites and the people of Lehi.
1 Nephi 18:25. Wait, is that how you say that? How do you say that? How do you?
I assume.
Okay. Is it 1 Nephi verse 18? No, chapter 18, verse 25. Is that how that goes?
Maybe.
Okay.
If they're following like the Bible.
All right. So let's try again.
We'll be back after a quick break.
This episode of Tales from Ostlantis is brought to you by Ostlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromostlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
1 Nephi chapter 18, verse 25. Quote, "And it came to pass that we did find upon the land of promise, as we journeyed in the wilderness, that there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both the cow and the ox and the ass and the horse and the goat and the wild goat, and all manner of wild animals, which were for the use of men. And we did find all manner of ore, both of gold and of silver and of copper."
And
Alma, chapter 18, verse 9. Quote, "And they said unto him, Behold, he's feeding thy horses. Now the king had commanded his servants, previous to the time of the watering of the flocks, that they should prepare his horses and chariots, and conduct him forth to the land of Nephi, for there had been a great feast appointed at the land of Nephi by the father of Lamoni, who was king all over the land." End quote.
so not only horses, but chariots as well.
That's right. You want to see my horses?
Of course, the Book of Mormon is a religious text and not a source of historical, archaeological, genetic, or linguistic evidence. And considering the origins of this particular text, I can state with confidence that we shouldn't be using the Book of Mormon to prove anything other than the salesmanship of one Joseph Smith. The second group, the wild horse conservationists, want to get wild horses granted the status of a threatened or endangered species. However, this status is only granted to native species original to the continent since the first contact period between Europe and America. A species that went extinct and was later reintroduced, such as the horse, doesn't usually qualify for this protected status. This has led some conservationists to embrace and actively promote the narrative that horses never went extinct in the Americas to further their cause. For example, one conservationist website states,
"It had been thought that they mysteriously went extinct in the hemisphere almost 12,000 years ago. However, recent scientific research and archaeological digs have provided a considerable body of evidence that some remnant horses did survive and continued to endure up to the time of the colonization of the Americas by Europeans."
We'll be back after a quick break.
This episode of Tales from Ostlantis is brought to you by Ostlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromostlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. While I'm sympathetic to the cause of protecting the wild horse, I don't think we need to rewrite history in order to do so. There are currently no known archaeological sites that support the claims made in that website. Now, for what it's worth, I think the fact that horses evolved in the Americas and eventually went extinct here is a strong enough argument that wild horses are a native species, as they all descend from that original group of horses. Horses came from here. It's a fact. Promoting the pseudo-historical claim that horses were always here does our ancestors a disservice. And this brings us to the third and final group, which is comprised of some, but not all, indigenous groups who see the history of the horse as intrinsically intertwined with their own, and who maintain through oral tradition that the horse has always been here and never went extinct in the Americas. Now, let me be clear. I have great respect for oral tradition, but I think we make a mistake when we promote oral traditions as literal retellings of the past instead of malleable stories whose narratives can shift and evolve to better suit the cultural needs of the time. I think treating oral traditions as some sort of immutable truth robs our ancestors of their basic humanity by painting them as these romanticized, infallible beings. To put it bluntly, people make stuff up all the time, and it's not always for a bad reason. Now, these three groups tend to rely on the same bits of evidence to support their claims. I'm not going to go into a deep analysis of all of them, but I wanted to include one particular example, the Pratt Cave site near El Paso, Texas. Of the handful of archaeological sites used to bolster the claim that horses were always here, I find Pratt Cave to be a perfect example of how actual archaeological research is often deliberately misrepresented in the service of pseudo-history and conspiracy. The Pratt Cave site is presented as evidence in the article, "Were there horses in the Americas before Columbus?" But yeah, there were. Like, that's the wrong question to be asking, right? Like, we know there were. By Dr. Stephen E. Jones. So who's Dr. Stephen E. Jones? Well, from the website Archaefantasies.
Dr. Jones is a retired physicist from Brigham Young University known for his 9/11 truther theories and his ideas about cold nuclear fusion. He's active on several websites involved in proving the Book of Mormon as factually true and has chosen American horses as his evidence.
In his article for Ancient American Magazine, a well-known source of pseudo-history and conspiracism, Dr. Jones states,
"The first of these found in Pratt Cave near El Paso, Texas by Professor Ernest Landelius of Texas A&M University. Professor Landelius responded to my inquiries and provided a horse bone from Pratt Cave, which he dated to BCE 6020 through 5890. This date is well since the last ice age, into the time frame when all American horses should have been absent according to the prevailing paradigm." End quote.
Well, on its face, the argument appears pretty solid, right? Dr. Landelius, a professor from Texas A&M, conducted research at Pratt Cave and excavated a human occupation site there. Horse bones were found associated with the site, thus proving that horses existed in the Americas long after they should have gone extinct. But is that really what happened? Well, not exactly. Once again, from archae-fantasies.
Pratt Cave is roundly accepted to be a Holocene starting roughly about 11,700 years ago site, and within the collection of artifacts associated with that time period, no extinct species are found. And this is from the site Harris 2013. I'm not sure who that is. Do you know who that is? Harris 2013?
I do not.
This means that there are no horse bones found that are related to the actual findings for the cave assemblage. Landelius did indeed find 2 specimens of equus in the cave, again from Harris 2013. These 2 bones were found on or very near the surface, not in the associate artifact assemblage of Pratt Cave.
So I read Dr. Landelius's report, and he clearly states that the horse bones
represent modern, feral, or domesticated horses.
So one wonders why Dr. Jones chose to ignore that particular tidbit, right?
Especially since it's talking about the key word here being, or the operative word being what? Modern. How convenient that they leave that out, right?
Exactly. So basically, when you excavate a site, you dig down. And in archaeology, we have what's called the law of superposition. And the law of superposition states that generally the stuff that's deeper in the ground is older than the stuff that's near the surface.
You don't say.
And, there are exceptions to this. Natural disasters, right. What we call bioturbation of animals getting in there and mixing stuff around. But basically what happened is Landelius excavated this human occupation site and encountered a human occupation site. But further up near the surface were some horse bones, which were modern horse bones. So they were not even in indirect association with the actual artifact assemblage that he was studying.
Yeah.
So if you're using that as your evidence, that's a huge swing and a miss,
right?
In my opinion.
Recent research.
The horses never went extinct claim was recently given new life thanks to social media and the misinterpretation of the paper Early Dispersal of Domestic Horses into the Great Plains and Northern Rockies, recently published in the journal Science. After examining archaeological remains of horses, researchers suggest indigenous peoples spread the animals through the American West by the first half of the 1600s, before they encountered Europeans. As stated in Smithsonian Magazine,
3 of the horses with remains from Wyoming, Kansas, and New Mexico date to before the Pueblo Revolt. And rather than simply roaming the countryside on their own, the horses appear to have been part of Native American culture. Dental damage on one horse and bony growth on the skull of another suggest people had put bridles on the animals, per Science News' Bruce Bauer. Certain chemical elements in the creature's teeth signaled they ate maize, an indigenous crop. And another horse had a healed facial fracture, meaning it might have been given veterinary attention, per Live Science. The researchers compared the ancient horse's DNA with that of modern horses and found that the centuries-old equines had largely Spanish ancestry. Together, the findings suggest horses spread from Spanish settlements in the American Southwest to the northern Rockies and the central Great Plains by the first half of the 17th century, per the paper.
Now, don't get me wrong. It's a really cool paper and really cool research, and it places horses in indigenous hands about 100 years earlier than previously thought. Basically, after the arrival of the Spanish, some of their horses ran away or were stolen and then incorporated into native cultures. Fascinating stuff for sure, and an example of science in action. But what the paper does not claim is that horses were always here. In fact, the paper says the exact opposite.
Taylor et al. Looked at the genetics of horses across the Old and New Worlds and studied archaeological samples. They found no evidence for direct Pleistocene ancestry of North American horses, but they did find that horses of European descent had been integrated into indigenous cultures across Western North America long before the arrival of Europeans in that region. That's the operative phrase there. In that region.
Exactly. Yep. So the problem is nobody on social media is bothering to actually read the paper.
No.
Instead, yeah, shocking, right?
You don't say.
Instead, they read the headlines and then they associate the paper with the claims of, the horses were always here crowd. You then copy, share, and repeat. And now you have a whole new wave of people thinking that there was a scientific paper proving that horses never went extinct in the Americas. And I'm seeing this.
What's funny is that when Origin came out, Jennifer Raff's book, a lot of people were also assuming that she was making the claim that humans had always been in the Americas. It was weird. They didn't read the book.
Yeah, because they didn't read the book. Yeah.
Strange.
So, yeah, and I'm seeing this. I'm seeing this online that people are sharing, links to this story, to this paper, thinking that it supports the claim that horses were always here, and they're not actually reading the paper.
Checkmate.
Yeah, right. And honestly, I think some of the media outlets reporting on the paper share some of the blame. For example, check out these ambiguous and somewhat sensationalistic headlines.
New research rewrites the history of American horses. Smithsonian Magazine. Native Americans used horses far earlier than historians had believed. The Hill.
Right? So if all you read are those, right, it kind of sounds, and you're already predisposed to think that the horses were always here, and you see those headlines.
I told you, science is finally catching up to indigenous ways of knowing. Oh my goodness! Did you read the paper?
So, yeah, and if you never bothered to read the actual paper or the stories associated with the paper, you can be convinced that the latest research confirms the idea that horses were always here. Fortunately, not all media outlets had such terrible headlines. For example,
horses came to American West by early 1600s, study finds. This is the AP. Native Americans corralled Spanish horses decades before Europeans arrived, by Science News.
So those headlines are way better.
Yeah, I think they do a much better service to the actual story than the previous ones.
Yeah, I mean, they're actually conveying the information that's presented in the paper, right? Within the confines of a headline, which you don't have a lot of room to work with anyway. And as we know, people like to just read headlines and then share.
They're still too long. I'm of the opinion that your headline, your title should be short and sweet. I mean, in history, we have a habit of doing like these super long titles, but that's because it's a history paper. But for like a blog post or a little news story, like your headlines shouldn't take up no more than one line on a page. If it's more than half of a line on a page, you've There's too many words in there.
Yeah. Editing is key.
Yeah.
But I especially like the AP headline.
Yeah, that one was short and sweet, and it's to the point, and it doesn't sensationalize, and it leaves it open for you to like, let me find out, what is this paper actually saying?
Exactly. Now, look, I know that a lot of our people have an inherent distrust of science and academia, some of which is absolutely deserved. We need to acknowledge the biases that many non-native researchers have, but the answer isn't to be blinded by our own biases, along with the outright dismissal of the quote-unquote white man's science. Rather, we need Indigenous archaeologists, Indigenous historians, Indigenous geneticists, etc., to tell our own stories. Science does not belong to any one particular ethnic group or race, and we do ourselves a disservice when we act like it does.
Want to see my horses?
And here's the thing, right? I'm not even against the idea that somebody would ask the question, is it possible that horses did not go extinct during the Pleistocene? That's like a valid hypothesis to me, but it's a hypothesis that you can test.
Right.
You could test it using the tools of science.
Well, as a historian, I'm gonna just make it even simpler than that. I'm gonna throw this out there and see what you think. If it had been the case that horses never went extinct, and when the Spanish first arrived on the American mainland, I mean, you would think that the horse would have made it throughout at least most of North America, which includes Mexico and what we call Central America.
They would have seen horses everywhere.
So there would have been horses in Mexico as well. It's not like the border, that exists today. All of a sudden, like back then, the horses like, well, we can't go south of the river, south of the Rio Grande, and south of that line that's going to exist, 300 years from now. And so those people down there don't know of our existence, but we do up here. The people up here do, but down there they don't. Like, it just doesn't make sense, even if you're looking at it from a historical perspective. The horse would have been so ubiquitous. It would have been everywhere. The Mexica, the Aztec, the Huaxotzinca, the Tlatelolco, everyone who encountered the Spanish would have seen the horse, and they would have said, yeah, we got horses too, and Ike, right? Like, that wouldn't have been such a big deal. Well,
and not only that, but these are civilizations that built monumental architecture and built massive temples. If they had had beasts of burden, like a horse, they would have, the empire builders, the Mexica, right? They especially would have had horses everywhere because they would have been such a valuable tool.
They would have been like the Mongol Empire, essentially. I mean, it would have overrun most of North America, at least well into the plains, if they'd had the horse. Absolutely. Exactly. I mean, look at the Comanche example, right? The Cheyenne and the Lakota, who, cultures that pride themselves, because of the horse culture that evolved after it was introduced. Now, imagine that same kind of mentality with the Mexica and the Aztecs, right? I mean, there's just no way that the horse only existed in certain pockets of North America and it didn't in other places, especially in places where you have these, like you were saying, these societies and these civilizations, these cultures that were able to erect monumental structures. You would think that even just by trade, because we know that trade existed between Mesoamerica and what is now called the Southwest, and from the Southwest to other parts of the plains and up into the Pacific Northwest and there's evidence of trade networks connecting central Mexico as far as, east and northeast as, the Great Lakes and into even, the Haudenosaunee areas, right? So even just by word of mouth, even if the horse by itself didn't exist in central Mexico for whatever reason, right? They would have at least known of its existence by the sheer information that was traded during these various expeditions that the Mexica Aztec did with the Posteca going into these various places.
Yeah, and not only that, but these trade networks would have been even more robust
had they had horses. Because imagine how much stuff they could have carried instead of these burden baskets that they were carrying on their backs with, they traded macaw, they traded chocolate, cacao, but they wouldn't have, traded horses. Yeah. And if they had a horse, they wouldn't have ridden horses to do this trade.
Right.
And the amount of trade goods that would be here would be astronomical if they had horses to transport goods.
It would have been a completely different scenario had the horse actually existed in the Americas when the Spanish arrived. The story would have been completely different from what we know it today.
Yeah.
I mean, just the outcome of those two cultures meeting themselves head to head. I mean, the Mexica had the upper hand. If it wasn't for the diseases that basically did them in, the Mexica would have overpowered the Spanish and their allies. And in fact, the Spanish wouldn't have had the opportunity to recruit so many indigenous allies in the thousands if it were not for the fact that the Mexica were seen as becoming weak because of the diseases that were doing them in. Not because they were weak inherently, right? It was because the diseases were basically depopulating the major urban centers, especially Tenochtitlan. And that's when all these city-states that were allied with the Mexica Azteca decided to jump ship and say, well, maybe we need to get on board with these other guys, because if the Mexica are going to fall, then at least we can be
times are changing.
Times are changing. Let's get into the good graces here. And if it had not been for the fact that they didn't have the horse, that would have changed everything had they had it. The battle would have been more eye to eye than it ended up being, and the outcome of that would have been completely different than what we know it and we understand it today. So just even, that just basing it on that as a historian, right? That's what I'm looking at when I hear these things. I'm saying it just doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense that the horse would only exist in one part of North America and not in other parts of North America, unless you just kind of think that it only existed in one space.
Yeah, which is highly unrealistic, because even knowing what we know about the Pueblo Revolt, right? With those 1,500 horses that the Pueblo people acquired after they kicked out the Spanish, there was this massive trading of those horses.
Exactly.
So just with that small example, we know if there had been horses, they would have been everywhere, because everybody, how do you not use something as valuable as a horse?
And how do you even contain it, right? I mean, the sheer fact that the Spanish lost so many horses, that became the Mustang, which I looked into the word mesteño, where the word Mustang comes from, mesteño. It comes from the old Latin, and it basically means mixed. Mixed. Yeah, it comes from mixto.
Oh, really?
Mesta, mesteño. And that's the evolution of the word. And the reason why they use the word mesteño, the Spanish, is because they viewed the wild horses to not be pure. They were intermixing in the wild. So they were it's kind of like calling them mestizos almost.
Yeah.
That's what the word mesteño means.
Yeah. Mustangs are the Mexicans of the horse.
Right? That would have been the experience of these people. Unless they had the ability to corral them all, which I doubt. There's always a few that get away and they create their own feral herds, right? But even if they had the ability, had the horse existed, to be able to domesticate it and corral it and be able to ride it and use it for hunting and for warfare, I mean, just the history would have been so much different, even if you're not even looking at the science behind it. Just the history itself.
Yeah.
Would have been
we've got
different.
Members pottery. We've got petroglyphs of traders that have been interpreted as people who are traders, or pochtecas, as we call them in Nahuatl, carrying goods on their backs.
On their back. Isn't that what the Cocopelli is also purported to
it's
come
what
from?
It's alleged to be.
Yeah,
a person. Yeah, I've heard that. I don't know. That's one of the claims that are made.
One of the claims, right.
But regardless, why would they be sending people
on foot
if they had horses?
If they had horses.
And the other thing is claiming that, oh no, we always had horses. Horses were always here. It really discounts indigenous ingenuity. the people who, like going back to the Mexica, to these individuals who built this monumental architecture, the fact that they were able to do this without a horse.
Without the horse, exactly. But it was aliens. I thought you knew that.
So this is amazing. Like, we have this amazing history that didn't need the horse, of all these, trade networks and civilizations that were built. And then even after the horse was brought, you have like the Nez Perce, right? They created the breed of the Appaloosa. And it's like robbing from them too, to be like, we always had horses.
Do they claim that breed of horse has always existed? Is that something that they claim in their stories?
Good question. That is a good question. I don't know. If anybody out there does know, hit us up on the social medias, because I would like to know the answer to that question. I do know, because I spoke to some Lakota people, and they're like, well, according to our oral traditions, we didn't have the horse.
Okay.
So, there's also that. And they're saying like, no, we did not have horses until, white people showed up.
And so to be clear, the indigenous people who are making these claims about the horse always existing in the Americas, the never gone extinct horse hypothesis, or whatever I called it earlier, that's a minority. Right?
Yeah.
This is
absolutely.
a very, very small minority of people who, for some reason, now, can we be more specific as to what kind of minority this? I mean, these aren't people in the community saying this stuff, right? Who are these people? The ones that are the more vocal within this group of people who are indigenous and who are advancing this claim, right? Who
they tend to be, and I hate to rail on it again, but they tend to be ethnic studies people in universities, and social activists, and who really, when you read their writings, they really have a chip on their shoulder. So they're like, we need to, our history is written with all these biases of white people, and that needs to be done away with. But then they come at it with their own biases, right? Like, and they let it known right off the bat.
It's not like it's I don't know if this is a good parallel but it's almost like the Black Olmec, right? It's like you take it to the extreme, right? Like, your history has been, told a certain way, and your people have been treated a certain way. And now that you're in those circles where you have a voice and where you can, influence others, you take it to the extreme and then make these.
Yeah, now it's your turn to say crazy shit
without evidence, or cherry picking the evidence to fit the argument that you're trying to advance, and discounting that evidence which does not support it. And this is problematic. People might say, well, yeah, if it's a minority of folks, then, who cares? Whatever, let them have their say. Maybe eventually one day they'll reconsider and change their mind, and that's great to think about. But when you consider that in history textbooks, and there's one in particular that I know of personally because I've used it in my classes, when we're looking at the very first chapter where we're introducing indigenous societies and cultures that existed prior to the arrival of Europeans, there's a textbook that actually, I'm not sure if it's the Pratt Cave, the one that we discussed just now, or if it's a different one, but they show almost like a petroglyph or some kind of
I know what you're talking about. I forget the name.
Rock, and they use that as a reference to suggest, they're not like saying directly, yes, we know for a fact, but they're implying that there's a question out there and that's being debated, almost kind of like the whole climate change thing, where you try to both sides it when there's really no two sides to that.
Yeah, you just kind of muddy the waters a little bit.
They're muddying the waters. They're trying to almost like both sides it, when in fact there really is no evidence. And like you were saying earlier, with the Pratt Cave, it could be one of those things where maybe the rock shows signs of it being carved in thousands of years ago, before the arrival of the Spanish, and then all of a sudden maybe someone came along at a later date after the horse was introduced and then carved something that resembles a horse. I mean, that could be it.
Well,
that could be it.
Yeah, I'll tell you from personal experience. I've done survey work on certain reservations. I don't want to say which one, but on this reservation, I had to do some rockfall mitigation, and there were pictographs and petroglyphs that needed to be protected during the blasting that was going to take place to mitigate this rockfall. And while I was up there, there were numerous, what they call, quote unquote, pre-contact, prehistoric petroglyphs that were recognizable. And the motifs, you recognize the motifs, and, in association with artifacts, you could kind of gauge like, oh, well, it must have been this timeline when these petroglyphs were drawn. And then not, 3 meters away, there's another petroglyph of a horse. And it was huge. And, nobody on that reservation is looking at those petroglyph panels and being like, oh, this must mean that our ancestors had horses, because they know the history of their region. They know the history of their own land. And they're like, oh yeah, these are horses that were drawn. This probably the 1800s. Somebody drew this petroglyph of a horse and etched it onto the same rock as these other, because it's our freaking rock. We could draw whatever we want on it. And nobody's saying, well, look, prehistoric petroglyph, and then there's a horse. Obviously, horses are prehistoric and were known by these people. That's like such a bizarre leap in logic to me to look at that and think that. A lot of this comes from this postmodern way of looking at the world, where they're just like, look, this is a story that makes me feel good, and so this is a story I'm going to believe. Despite any evidence to the contrary, it makes me feel good. Therefore, I'm going to lay claim to it and promote it as, as fact. And I think this is a dangerous way to approach history. And, and we're seeing stuff like, we're seeing the results of this play out in real time, where we saw an actual historical event like the storming of the Capitol being rewritten in real time by people who are just coming up with these weird narratives that are like, nope, that's actually not what happened. And they're rewriting it. And so we're seeing for ourselves, how history can be distorted. And just because it makes them feel good, because it conforms to the narrative of how they see the world, they're pushing this alternate view of history. And so we could see now, this is dangerous when we do this. It's not harmless, like, well, what's the harm, right? They're going to think whatever they want, just let it go, because that's how it starts. And then it evolves to, well, now the Olmecs were black, or, now Solutreans, white people came and civilized the Americas. It could start off innocuous in to some people, but it always, the end point is never good. Is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's it's part of our current existence today, where academia, scholarship, people who are deemed to be elites are perceived to be, sometimes the enemy, or sometimes people who don't have community's best interest at heart. They are just looking out for themselves. They're trying to advance their own careers at the expense of people's personal beliefs, cultures, etc. And I guess, if we're going to paint this in a positive light of any sort, the people who are indigenous and who are advancing these kinds of arguments in their scholarship, mainly it's really people who are in academia or adjacent to academia in some way, who are making these points, by and large. They could say, well, for the longest time, as you were saying earlier, Kurly, history and, white people have told our history a certain way, full of misconceptions, full of lies, full of stereotypes and racist tropes, etc. So now it's our turn to flip it on its head. If nothing matters anymore, if the facts be damned in all corners of our existence, of our life today, then why can't we also be a part of that? Why can't we also turn these traditional narratives on their head and try to advance our position as long as it advances our people in a positive way. And what I hear you saying is that the while that may be true, maybe in the immediate effect, it might be true that it's making things more positive for those communities. The long-term effects of advancing pseudo-history and pseudo-science and narratives that are not based on facts and evidence and truth, that those could end up hurting the communities in the long run because they're based on something that is inaccurate and false. Yeah,
it would be detrimental in the long run because it's based on a false foundation. And I'm all about the truth, man. You know what I say about the truth?
What do you say, Kurly?
The truth? Well, it's like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it is always good for you.
Horses, horses, horses.
Timo itase.
Wacha.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.